Life in the Trinity Ministry, in partnership with Brian McLaren, is pleased to present this series entitled The Storyline of the Bible.
I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. I just feel like the luckiest person in the world with these great young adult kids that I have. I feel sorry for all other parents that you didn't get the chance to raise these for, and you probably feel the same way about your kids. My younger son, Trevor, graduated from college earlier this year, and right after graduation, he wanted to do a sort of celebration trip, and his older brother, Brett, offered to help pay for that trip and took some time off work. So my 2 sons had a huge adventure. They spent 3 weeks touring around Asia. They went to Thailand, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and Japan, and they just had a great time. And it was really great for me as a father to see my kids, my 2 sons, just being pals and having fun together. And they wrote a blog where each of them would talk about their adventures. And just to think of them together having fun brought me incredible joy. It was especially good because my 2 sons are very different. And when they grew up, they did what almost all young boys do. They had lots of fights. In fact, before going on the trip, each of them asked me in private, "Dad, do you think I'm going to make it through this trip without killing my brother?" But they had a fantastic time. We're in this podcast, we're going through the biblical narrative. We're looking at it in 7 episodes. Episode 1 is creation, and we're now in episode 2, which is crisis. And interestingly, the crisis very early in the book of Genesis in the Bible is described as a crisis between brothers, and in fact, one brother killing the other. And interestingly, the book of Genesis ends with one brother forgiving his brothers who had tried to kill him. It's really quite remarkable. This theme of brother and brother suggests human beings getting along with each other. And this of course, is very close to the heart of the human crisis. Now, when we look at these stories in the first chapters of the book of Genesis, I think it's a big mistake to try to read these stories in a very wooden, literalistic way. I think ancient people, the way they understood the world is through stories, just as we do through scientific theories. They use stories. And those stories were their way of making sense of human experience and giving shape to it. And so we have, when the crisis part of the story opens, we have Adam and Eve and the serpent and the story of them taking the fruit and being banished from the garden. But it's interesting where the story goes next. This is Genesis chapter 4. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I brought forth a man." Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. And it's important to stop there and realize that even though human beings have been banished from the garden, they still are in touch with God. And she says, "With the help of the Lord, I brought forth a man." There's this sense of dependence and cooperation with God in God's creative, procreative work. And Adam and Eve they're ashamed in a certain sense, so they wear clothing now, but they still sexually they make love, and so in a way, in spite of the crisis, life goes on. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. Now we just read those verses, and we think, okay, this is part of the story. But I think for people in the ancient world who originally would have told these stories generation to generation, and then eventually written them down, those words would be very significant because the economic system of that world was divided into the herders and the farmers. The herders would move from place to place. They would have to go with their flocks to the place where there was fresh and new grass. The farmers, they would stay in the river valleys, and they would put up, they would build their fields and probably eventually put up fences in them, among other things, to keep the herders out. In this sense, then, we can see almost an anthropologist's description of the beginnings of human civilization. We start with hunter-gatherers like Adam and Eve, who just live in the garden. They live off the land, a very simple and innocent life. Then some begin to domesticate animals. They become the herders. And then some domesticate plants and they become the farmers. Let's see how the story unfolds. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Now, I just want you to notice the more primitive offering, the offering of the flock, was pleasing to God, but the offering of the more advanced farmer was less pleasing to God. It's as if the farther up we go in the ladder of civilization, the farther away we are from the garden and the more distant we become from God. You can sort of see that, can't you? Because when you become a farmer, you have a home and you aren't as exposed to the elements and you have more control over your world. You are a little more godlike. But when you're a nomad, you have to go to where the grass is growing and you're much more dependent. You can't have a big house. At the most, you can have a tent. You're a lot more in touch with God and God's world in that sense. So now we have tension. Abel is, in a certain sense, closer to God. Cain is, in a sense, farther from God, and this makes him angry. Then the Lord said to Cain, see, God reaches out even to the one who's far away. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? Isn't it interesting? God, in his dealings with human beings, first Adam and Eve and now Cain, begins with questions. He's not just interested in telling us what to do and ordering us around. He's inviting us into conversation. Again, remember that image, the Spirit hovering over the waters. God is inviting conversation. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So he's saying, you better be careful, Cain, because this anger that you have could get out of control and you could really do some evil. You'd better try to do what's right in this circumstance. But Cain doesn't do that. Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out into the field. Now, interesting, the field is Cain's territory because he's a farmer. And while they were in the field, while they were in Cain's territory, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Now, I think for ancient hearers of this story, this would have immediately brought to mind, yes, that's what happens. The farmers build their fields, and if the nomadic herders come through, the farmers kill them. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? Again, another question. I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? And so now Cain, he's already deceived his brother. Hey, let's go for a walk in the field. And now he's trying to deceive God. He's trying to trick God, Oh, am I my brother's keeper? I don't have to keep track of him wherever he goes. The Lord said, what have you done? Isn't it interesting? Even now, the Lord asks a question. He's inviting a response, an honest response. Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer in the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. It's as if God says, you think you're so advanced that now you're a farmer, and he says now your farming isn't going to work for you. And you're going to be banished to a nomadic life. You're going to, in a sense, regress. You aren't ready to live at that level you're living. You're going to regress and have to become a nomad like your brother had been. And Cain sees this as terrible. My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Now, this is strange, but now what Cain is realizing is he will be in the same situation that his nomadic herder brother Abel was in. That now if I have to wander around, I will experience just what he experienced, that other farmers will want to kill me. But the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. I just think there's so much going on in these primal stories. They're telling us about our own history as human beings. And they're telling us that we can advance to a certain point, and then we engage in violence. We don't respect our fellow human beings. And then when we do that, we end up going backwards to their level. And what looks like advance to us is actually very often a move farther away from God. And I think we also see the amazing mercy of God. Here is God, in a sense, protecting the perpetrator of a crime. But I think, in a way, what else is God to do? Because all human beings now are not only victims, but they're also villains. And now Cain becomes, and of course the old question, where did Cain and Abel get their wives? And Cain has a wife. So again, I just think trying to turn these stories into a wooden literal reading is certainly not necessary. But Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. Now, isn't it interesting? Here's human progress. We go from being hunter-gatherers like Adam and Eve to eventually not being willing to live within those limits. And then we become like Abel. We become nomadic herders. And then we settle down like Cain and we become farmers. And then we start to kill the nomadic herders. And then we can't even live as farmers anymore. And what do? Instead of just staying as nomadic herders, we then go to the next level and we build a city. And we're going to see what happens to the city later on. And so then civilization continues to develop. And soon we have musical instruments, and I think that suggests the development of culture. And then we have tools being made of bronze and iron. Again, these ancient stories are telling the story of human history, and they're saying it's been the story of people drifting away from their connection with their Creator and drifting into wanting to live without limits and not respecting one another's limits and one another's dignity, and then violence upon each other. And then what we have in the story is the next episode in the unfolding of the human crisis. Now, again, I'm not using the words that you often hear used, and I'm not saying those words are wrong, but you usually hear words like the fall. But that word, that term, the fall, again, it's not in the Bible. It comes from much, much later theological history, and it's useful in some ways. But I'd like to suggest that we just try to encounter these stories without those imported categories. And here's what I think happens. Instead of having one episode of Adam and Eve taking the fruit, we end up with a whole series of episodes that add layer upon layer to give us a multi-dimensional picture of the human crisis. The first human crisis of Adam and Eve is they don't believe God. And they think God is trying to limit them or oppress them. They don't want any limits. So they want to be like gods themselves. And so they refuse to live within the very simple, minimal limits that they needed to live in that state of harmony and innocence as hunter-gatherers. And then we have people become nomadic herders, and then others become settled farmers, and then there's conflict between them, and then we have the development of cities. And human evil, in a sense, increases with each level of human development. You really feel this when you come to Genesis chapter 6. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that these daughters were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with human beings forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. Now, I'm not even going to pretend to have the definitive explanation of these verses, but there's some sense now that human beings are trying to advance even higher. And God says, you know what? These people are dangerous when they live this long. We've got to make their lives be shorter because they just have the potential to create so much evil. And you really feel this when you get to verse 5 of chapter 6. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the hearts of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. Now, again, remember, these ancient stories are trying to take account for our world. I don't think you can take every detail and turn it into a huge theological treatise. Like, I don't think God is sort of whacking himself in the forehead saying, oh no, this thing's getting out of control, I better do something about it. But I think what we see here is this sense that human beings have, that the more advanced we become, the more evil we become. And you imagine people in the ancient world living in cities. What happens when people live in cities? One thing that happens is you start having slaves. So bigger and bigger percentages of the population are living in slavery. And you have the rich oppressing the poor, and the violent oppressing the meek. And the whole world is in such a mess that to God it's as if he says, boy, let's just wipe the slate clean, and let's let this thing start over again. It's just too ugly and too dangerous and too destructive. And I think there's this sense that human beings who told these ancient stories were saying, you know, we better be careful, because we can become so evil and so ugly that we just don't even deserve to continue existing. Now, that sense of violence is going to accelerate. And next will come the story of Noah and the ark, and how the earth is, in a sense, the slate is wiped clean, and God starts with a small family and rebuilds from there. And then comes the story, just a couple of chapters later, the story of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. And now, not only do we have first hunter-gatherers who become nomadic herders, who then become land-holding, settled farmers, who then become people who live in cities. But by the time we get to chapter 11, we have nations and empires developing. And of course, by calling it the Tower of Babel, they're evoking the Babylonian Empire, which was one of the early great empires with huge cities and incredible violence, and the domination of huge masses by very powerful elites. And that, when we get to the Tower of Babel, we start to feel just that suddenly it goes from being this ancient world that's so distant to being our world of today's civilization. And we then, I think, can go back and say, well, do these stories tell the truth about us? That we have left our limits as people in creation in relationship to God. And now we've embarked on a path of domination and evil, so much that sometimes we ourselves wonder, do we even deserve to exist with all the torture and violence and warfare and oppression? I think you'll agree that those stories really do tell the truth about us and about our situation. You know, Brett and Trevor came home from their trip in Asia, and they had such a great time. They had lots of digital photos to show and some funny and hilarious stories to tell. And they both grew up and they both changed from their journey. And those two boys who used to scrap and fight a lot when they were little really came home in a deeper way than ever as friends. And I think this is God's picture for us. He's telling us these stories about our past so that we will want to not let that trajectory of increasing evil and violence continue, but so that we'll want to reverse that trajectory, so that we'll want to move back toward reconciliation and harmony and peace. And it's interesting. That's exactly where the rest of the book of Genesis goes. This is Brian McLaren with Wired Parish.
You've been listening to Brian McLaren. You can visit Brian online at wiredparish.com.